Hey, genuine well wishes and constructive critics. I take it for granted you, your dear and near are hale and healthy. It's ideally earthling Professor S. Suresh with absolute enticement back for my 51st video in process for publication on YouTube today, 26th of July 2020. Topic for discussion today is causes and undesired consequences of wars. War is a waging of armed conflict against an enemy, a legal state created by a declaration of war and ended by official declaration during which the international rules of war apply. War, in the popular sense, is a conflict between political groups involving hostilities of considerable duration and magnitude. Unwritten rules for staging a war is first the declaration should be given to the enemy formally in advance prior to launching the attack officially. Law of war, that part of the international law dealing with the inception, concept and termination of warfare. Its aim is to limit the suffering caused to combatants and non-combatants, also known as innocent civilians. Military technology range of weapons, equipment, structures and vehicles used specifically for the purposes of warfare. It includes the knowledge acquired to construct the technology, to employ it in combat and to repair and replenish it. There are two prerequisites for a war between actors. One is that the cost of war cannot be overwhelmingly high. That is not true. By that we mean that there must be some plausible situations in the eyes of the decision makers such that the anticipated gains from the war in terms of resources, power, glory, territory and so forth exceed the expected cost of conflict, including expected damages to property and life. Thus, for war to occur with rational actors, at least one of the sides involved has to expect that the gains from the conflict will outweigh the costs incurred. Without these prerequisites, there can be lasting peace. Second, as cogently argued by Fieran, there has to be a failure in bargaining so that for some reason there is an inability to reach a mutually advantageous and enforceable agreement. The main tasks in understanding war between rational actors are thus to see why bargaining fails and what incentives or circumstances might lead countries to arm in ways such that the expected benefits from war outweigh the cost for at least one of the sides. 5 reasons for bargaining failure: asymmetric information about the potential costs and benefits of war, a lack of ability to enforce a bargaining agreement and or a lack of the ability to credibly commit to abide by the agreement, indivisibilities of resources that might change hands in a war so that not all potentially mutually beneficial or bargaining agreements are feasible, agency problems where the incentives of leaders differ from those of the populations that they represent, multilateral interactions where every potential agreement is blocked by some coalition of states or constituencies who can derail it. War will last until either one side has emerged victorious or the situation has changed, so the cost of continued conflict have become overwhelmingly high for all sides. Such a lack of enforceable agreements is often one of the main ingredients leading to protracted wars. In contrast, suppose that enforceable and credible agreements are possible, but that the states start with asymmetric information, for instance, about the relative strength of one of the two countries. In such a case, there can be a bargaining failure which leads to war. However, in such a setting, once war really happens, the relative strengths of the countries can become clearer, and given that credible bargaining is possible and can avoid further cause of war, the states could then reach an agreement to end the war. Treaty. So, different durations of war can correspond to different sources of bargaining failures. In principle, a war between the theocracies or two states led by people of different religions can be thought of as having rational explanations. It's a question of defining the objectives of the agents. For example, the goal might not be materially based, but might be based on the increasing the size of the population of one religion or eradicating another. In such situations, even with full commitment and bargaining opportunities, there might be no agreement that appeases an aggressor. One reason that one might place such motivations outside of the realm of rationality is that such objectives are often not put forth by a leader as if they are acting by choice, but instead leaders claim to be acting on behalf or under the direction of a higher being or religious code. Thus, the leaders in such settings do not necessarily view themselves as optimizing or choosing between paths, but instead as following ordained directions. Perhaps even more importantly, from a perspective, such agents cannot be bargained with. That is, even if agreements are available and fully enforceable, such agents are driven by a specific goal that may be incompatible with the well-being or autonomy of another population. Thus, there is a critical distinction between a leader who is choosing and optimizing even though the his or her rhetoric may be religious in nature, and a leader who believes that he or she acts simply as a channel for a higher being. Revenge is another reason for war that one could instinctively place within a set of non-rationalist explanations of war. Ethnic cleansing and other ideological mass killings, genocide, are other reasons for war. Two necessary ingredients for a war between rational agents. First, the cost of war cannot be overwhelmingly high, that is, the war to occur, at least one of the parties must see a net potential gain from war under some circumstances. Second, there must be some impediment to bargaining so that an enforceable and credible agreement cannot be reached. Effectively, rational decision makers weigh gains and losses from war given their objectives, beliefs, environment, and constraints. So, if a mutually advantageous agreement is possible, they should reach it. Even in situations where countries are balanced in the short run, a country may fear that an opponent will become stronger over time and that the balance will be destabilized over time, and may therefore wish to attack today to prevent being attacked by a stronger opponent in the future. Almost 70% of the conflicts, 7-0, end with a negotiated settlement, and almost no conflict ends with the complete elimination of one side. War leads to disastrous effects on people and the physical, biological, economic, and social environment. Environmental effects include direct contamination of air, land, and water, disruption of the infrastructure of society, which in turn leads to further environmental damage, use of non-renewable sources of energy, and diversion of resources that might otherwise be used for promoting health and protecting the environment. Much can be done to minimize the environmental consequences of war and to help prevent war. Public health-based approaches include surveillance and documentation of the adverse impacts of war on the environment, education, and awareness raising, and design, advocacy for and implementation of policies and programs to protect the environment, to control weapons that can harm the environment, and to help prevent war. War has direct, immediate, and deadly impact on human life and health. The body counts and the data on those with the war caused injuries and disabilities, both physical and psychological destruction of it, were, while woefully incomplete, document that many people tragically killed and wounded as a direct result of military activities. Destruction of infrastructure has led to food shortages and resultant malnutrition, contamination of food and drinking water, and resultant foodborne and waterborne illness, and medical care and public health deficiencies and resultant diseases. Preparation for war can also adversely affect human health. Some of the impacts are direct, such as injuries and deaths during training exercises. Others are indirect. As with the war itself, preparation for war can divert human, financial, and other resources that otherwise might be used for health and human services. Damage to the physical environment, water, land, air, and outer space, besides use of non-renewable resources, may result from war or preparation for war. Lakes, rivers, streams, and aquifers, land masses, and the atmosphere may be polluted through testing and use of weaponry. Outer space may be damaged through placement of weapons. Non-renewable resources can be used in weapons production, testing, and use. A nation's economy may be adversely affected through diversion of resources of military activities from education, housing, nutrition, and other health services, and through an increase in national debt under taxation. Nowadays, countries are using satellites to spy on other countries. Google Maps and all that, for which satellites are being used. Satellites are used for education purposes also, but some satellites are purely for destruction, espionage. These economic impacts affect both developed and developing countries. Destruction is easy, construction is tedious, time consuming, expensive. Governmental and societal preoccupation with the preparation for wars, often known as militarism, may lead to massive diversion and subversion of efforts to promote human welfare. This preoccupation and this diversion may be part of policies that lead to preemptive war when an attack is allegedly imminent, and a preventive war when an attack may be feared sometime in the future. Diversion of resources is a problem worldwide, but is especially acute in developing countries. Another impact, the indirect impact of war, is the creation of many refugees and internally displaced persons whose basic human needs may not be met. The biological environment may be disrupted in many ways as a result of weapons technologies. Nuclear weapons production, testing, use and disposal may release ionizing radiation. Shells hardened with depleted uranium also release ionizing radiation. Conventional and chemical weapons may release toxic substances during production, testing, use and disposal. Infectious diseases may have been rarely caused by the production, testing and use of biological weapons, much more commonly during war. Infectious diseases occur due to inadequate medical care and public health services, lack of safe food or water, unsafe sewage disposal, forced migration and crowded living circumstances. The detonation of nuclear bombs, weapons of mass destruction, over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in August 1945 during World War II by the Americans in retaliation for the Pearl Harbor attack by the Japanese led to the immediate deaths of approximately 200,000 people, primarily civilians, as well as lasting injury and later death of many others, and massive devastation and widespread radioactive contamination of the environment of these two cities. Nuclear weapons present hazards in virtually all areas of the life cycle. Production and testing have their own impacts. The U.S. National Cancer Institute estimated that the release of iodine-131 in fallout from U.S. nuclear test explosions was by itself responsible for 49,000 excess cases of thyroid cancer among the U.S. population. A 1991 publication by the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War estimated that the strontium-90, cesium-137, carbon-14 and polonium-239 released worldwide in all nuclear test explosions would be responsible for 430,000 cancer deaths by 2000. Additional widespread health and environmental effects of nuclear weapons production include massive contamination of land by radioactive materials and toxic chemicals. Nuclear power plants are another biohazard. All of us are aware of the worst industrial accidents in nuclear power plants like Long Mile Island in USA, Daiichi, Japan, Chernobyl, Ukraine. Radiation at nuclear plants leads to leukemia, dementia, pulmonary fibrosis, etc. More than 600 oil fires in Kuwait during the Persian Gulf War accounted for widespread environmental devastation as well as acute and possibly chronic respiratory ailments among people who were exposed to the smoke from these fires. As a further example, bombing of mangrove forests during the Vietnam War led to destruction of these forests, and the resultant bomb craters remain several decades afterward, often filling with the stagnant water that is a breeding ground for mosquitoes that transmit malaria and other diseases. Dirty bombs consisting of conventional explosive devices mixed with radioactive materials or attacks on nuclear power plants with explosive weapons could widely scatter highly radioactive materials. An extremely dense toxic and radioactive material, depleted uranium, shortly DU, used as a casing, increases the ability of the shell to penetrate the armor of tanks. DE is also pyrophoric and bursts into flame on impact. DU encased shells are used by the United States during the Persian Gulf War and the Iraq War and the war in Kosovo. Similar shells are used by the United Kingdom in the Iraq War. DU can cause contamination of the soil and groundwater. DU presents less of radioactive threat outside of the body and naturally occurring uranium. A variety of chemical weapons and related materials have the potential for contaminating the environment during war and the preparation for war. The potential for exposure exists not only for the military and civilian populations who may be exposed during the use of chemical weapons in wartime, but also for workers involved in the department, production, transport and storage of these weapons, and community residents living near facilities where these weapons are developed, produced, transported and stored. In addition, disposal of these weapons, including the disassembly and incineration, can be hazardous. The Chemical Weapons Convention, shortly CWC, which entered into effect in 1997, prohibits all development, production, acquisition, stockpiling, transfer and use of chemical weapons. Biological agents, biowar, are bacteria, viruses, other microorganisms and their toxins that not only produce human illness but can also lead to long-term contamination of the environment, not only affecting humans but potentially also other animals and plants. Even the recent spread of COVID-19, there is a widespread, I would say, rumor that it's a biowar by one country and another. Biological agents have been used, although infrequently, during wars over many centuries. There are now approximately 80 million landmines are still deployed worldwide in approximately 78 countries. These landmines have been termed weapons of mass destruction, one person at a time. They have often been placed in rural areas, posing a threat to residents of these areas and often disrupting farming and other activities. Civilians are the most likely to be injured or killed by landmines, which continue to injure and kill 15,000 to 20,000 people annually. Hazardous waste from military operations represent political contaminants of the air, water, and soil. Both during war and the preparation of a war, the military of many nations consumes huge amounts of fossil fuels and other non-renewable materials. Armed conflict forces people to leave from their homes. The need arises for temporary shelter. Camps for internally displaced persons and refugees can have significant environmental impacts on agricultural land, forests, and other ecosystems. Refugees and internally displaced persons also require safe water and food sanitation systems, medical care, and public health services, all of which could have direct or indirect environmental consequences. Many developing countries spend substantially more on military expenditure than on health-related expenditures. So many civilians are affected directly by losing their lives, losing their relatives, sexual abuses, etc. Children become orphans, losing their parents in war. Sometimes even children are forced to join the army, especially during major wars like World Wars I and II. So many innocent civilians continue to lose their lives and limbs because of landmines planted, especially during Vietnam War. Besides atom bombs, hydrogen bombs, nuclear warheads, nowadays biological warheads are also used in warfare, in particular Desert Storm operation by Americans in the Middle East. As a matter of fact, in case of if there happens to be a third world war, all the sentient species will be wiped out in a matter of seconds. All nations have so much firepower, and it will be literally like a video game, just pressing buttons. It's a question who is pressing the button first. All countries are spending so much money on so-called defense. Nowadays we use artificial intelligence and all that, depending on machines than computers and all that. It is like a rat race, like also known as Cold War. In all nations like to possess better weapons, missiles, warplanes, warships, nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, etc. than the enemies. All nations have intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBM, that are smart ones which can be launched from ships, land, or air. Cyber wars are using computers with internet connection illegally for hacking with a malicious intent. Usage of napalm bombs and burning people alive is highly inhuman. Abuse of children is highly rampant during wars. It is absolutely clear that overall effects of war are undesirable and cause a lot of hardship to non-combatants too. Hence, at any cost, all costs, prevent or at least curtail wars. Just think of the savings that will accrue. This amount could be spent productively for so many other purposes like improving infrastructure, healthcare, technology, education, etc. If all nations are friendly with all other nations in the world, there is no necessity for armed forces. Similarly, if everybody follows all the rules and regulations to the core, highly disciplined, there is no necessity for police, home guards, paramilitary, etc. It is basically greediness that leads to enmity, which ultimately results in wars, crimes, religious conflicts, racism, genocide, etc. Politicians and business community add fuel to this fire for their own benefits. Some of the statements used expressed are solely mine based on limited knowledge gained over 6 decades. Debates, discussions on topics like this can go on forever. Anyhow, let me call it a day. We'll meet again real soon with another good topic. Live in rest in peace and harmony. Always watch these videos with closed captions, subtitles for absolute 100% comprehension as per my sincere recommendation zillion times so far, if not more. I know I rushed through to complete the presentation within 20 minutes max. This is a time limit. I had set myself to retain the viewer's attention as a norm. I know nowadays I exceed this time limit since I make honest attempts to cover the selected topics more elaborately, including so many intricate, fine details referring a wide variety of sources, in particular Wikipedia, quite extensively, besides articles and books published recently. In addition, I had my own salt and pepper and masala based on my personal experiences so far in my life and also intuition. Stay at home as much as possible to maintain social distancing attributed to pandemic novel COVID-19 and prolong your lifespan. Lead a healthy life, not a filthy life. God alone can put a stop to natural or unnatural events, maybe bio war, cyber war, like pandemics, which may lead to apocalypse and extinction of all sentient species on earth. For no fault of theirs, all the best. Peace.